The warm water ran over my hands, soap bubbles swirling in the sink as I scrubbed the last plate clean. The quiet hum of the kitchen filled the space, the rhythmic sound of water running, the occasional clink of dishes as I stacked them beside me. The evening was calm, the house dimly lit, the air thick with the lingering scent of dinner and something softer, something unspoken. I barely noticed when he stepped into the room. The sound of his footsteps was soft, almost hesitant, but when I glanced over my shoulder, he was already leaning against the counter, watching me. "You always clean up right after?" he asked, his voice low, smooth, carrying the faintest edge of amusement. I exhaled a quiet laugh, rinsing off the plate. "It's better than waking up to a mess," he hummed, tilting his head slightly. "Efficient." "Responsible," I corrected, placing the plate on the drying rack. His smirk deepened, and I could feel the weight of his gaze lingering on me as I reached for the next dish. "You ever have fun?" I glanced at him, arching a brow. "Washing dishes isn't exactly thrilling. Maybe you're doing it wrong." The words sent a slow, unexpected ripple of something through me, curling low in my stomach. I swallowed, focusing on the water running over my fingertips, trying to ignore the way my pulse suddenly felt more pronounced. "Not sure there's a wrong way to do dishes," I murmured. A pause. Then, "Let's make this more fun." My breath hitched, fingers tightening briefly around the sponge. I turned slightly, just enough to catch the look in his eyes, the slow, knowing smirk playing at his lips. The air in the kitchen felt warmer now, heavier, a shift so subtle yet so undeniable that I knew. This was no longer about the dishes. The silence stretched between us, thick and unspoken, but not uncomfortable. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the slow drip of water from the faucet, the distant sound of a car passing outside. But all of it faded into the background, drowned out by the weight of his gaze, the heat that lingered in the space between us. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" I asked, my voice quieter now, almost wary. His smirk widened slightly, his fingers tapping against the countertop, slow, deliberate. "Depends. Are you open to suggestions?" I exhaled, my lips twitching despite myself. "I'm listening." He stepped forward, slow, measured, the air shifting as he moved closer. The space between us was already small, but now it felt even smaller, charged with something I wasn't sure I was ready to name. His eyes flickered down to my hands, still submerged in the soapy water, before lifting back to mine. "You do everything so carefully," he murmured, his voice lower now, quieter, like he was testing something. "So precise." My pulse ticked up. "And that's a bad thing?" He shrugged, his fingers brushing the edge of the counter, close but not quite touching. "Not bad. Just predictable." The words settled between us, heavy with implication. I should have stepped back, should have ended this conversation before it became something else entirely. But instead, I stayed where I was, my skin warming beneath the weight of his stare. His fingers finally moved, just barely, tracing along the edge of the sink, then dipping into the water for just a moment before pulling back, shaking off a few stray drops. "See? Not so serious." I huffed a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "That's your idea of fun? Getting my kitchen wet? Could be worse." I arched a brow. "I'm almost afraid to ask." His smirk deepened. "You should be." The air crackled between us then, the weight of the moment pressing down, thick, heady, something neither of us wanted to acknowledge, but neither of us was willing to break. I felt the way my breath slowed, the way my fingers curled just slightly against the edge of the sink, grounding myself against something I wasn't sure I could control. He didn't step back. Neither did I. And suddenly, the dishes felt like the last thing on my mind. The silence between us stretched, thick with something neither of us named, but both of us felt. The hum of the refrigerator droned on, the faint trickle of water from the faucet filled the quiet, but all I could focus on was him. Standing too close. Watching too intently. My fingers twitched around the sponge, my skin still warm from the water, from his stare. I could feel my pulse in my throat, steady but heavy, a quiet drum against the slow rhythm of my breath. "You're staring," I murmured, my voice softer now, not accusing but acknowledging. Am I? His smirk deepened, lazy and knowing. Or are you just noticing now? My lips parted, an inhale catching just slightly. I could have laughed it off, could have turned back to the dishes, could have let the moment pass like steam dissipating in the air. But I didn't, because he was right. I was noticing, and I wasn't looking away either. His fingers tapped against the counter, slow, rhythmic, like he was giving me time, waiting to see what I'd do next. So, he mused, you gonna let me help, or are you too committed to doing things the hard way? I huffed a quiet laugh, shaking my head. I don't think you've ever helped with dishes in your life. His smirk widened, a slow, deliberate movement. Maybe I just needed the right reason. My stomach tightened, a slow, unwelcome warmth curling low. I shifted my weight, my hands still damp, fingers pressing against the edge of the sink. And what exactly would that be? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached forward, plucking the sponge from my grasp, his fingers grazing against mine. Warm, steady, intentional. I swallowed, my breath hitching slightly. You really want to help? His gaze flickered down to my hands, then back up to my face, the slow curl of amusement never leaving his lips. Not really. My pulse kicked up. Then what are you doing? Seeing how long you'll let me get away with it. The words sent a sharp jolt through me, something hot and unsteady unraveling in my stomach. He was testing me, pushing just enough to see if I'd push back. The weight of his stare, the way he held himself, the slow, measured cadence of his voice, it wasn't just teasing anymore. It was something else. Something we weren't supposed to name. I exhaled, slow and measured, even though my pulse betrayed me. You should be careful with that. With what? With testing limits. His smirk deepened, the corners of his mouth twitching like he had already decided on his next move before I had even finished speaking. What if I like testing limits? My stomach flipped, heat coiling tighter. Then you should be prepared for consequences. His fingers flexed once around the sponge before he finally set it down, his hands brushing over the edge of the sink, close, but not touching. The air between us buzzed with something electric, something neither of us was willing to step away from. The warmth of the kitchen, the scent of soap and lingering dinner, the quiet hum of a house that felt far too still, everything melted into the background, leaving just this. Him, me, and a choice I wasn't ready to make. His voice dropped lower, softer. And what if I'm willing to take the risk? The words sent another slow ripple through me, something heady, something undeniable. My fingers curled against the counter, nails pressing lightly into the smooth surface. Then maybe that's the problem. He held my gaze for a second longer, unreadable, before his lips curved once more. Maybe? The weight of the moment lingered, stretching, waiting. And for the first time, I wasn't sure who would be the one to step back first. I wasn't sure I wanted to.